Have you ever felt like you did everything right, set the boundary, told the truth, walked away, and still felt like the villain? That's not confusion, that's conditioning. Because in a dysfunctional family system, clarity isn't rewarded, it's punished. The scapegoat isn't chosen because they're chaotic. They're chosen because they won't pretend. And if you've ever felt like your very presence became a problem, like the room got quieter when you spoke, or like healing made you more alone, not less, this is why. You weren't cast out because you failed. You were cast out because you saw the system for what it was, and you stopped participating. And in this video, we're not going to talk about healing in abstract terms. We're going to expose the structure, the role, the psychology, and the aftermath of being made the family scapegoat, because the pain didn't start when they rejected you. It started when you believed them. In dysfunctional families, problems aren't solved, they're redirected. What can't be named is assigned. What can't be confronted is displaced. And someone, usually the one who sees it first, becomes the container. This is the function of the scapegoat. Not a role chosen by behavior, but one created by emotional economics. The scapegoat absorbs what the family refuses to integrate. Shame, grief, anger, contradiction. Their purpose is not to cause conflict, but to stabilize denial. It's not personal, it's structural. When a family is built on the appearance of cohesion, anything that threatens that illusion must be neutralized. And that includes honesty, especially honesty delivered without performance, without apology, without the emotional tone that makes it easy to digest. The scapegoat is not the most damaged member. They're the most unwilling to pretend. This is why scapegoating functions so efficiently. It keeps everyone else emotionally clean by assigning the dirt to one person. Their reactions are pathologized. Their emotions are exaggerated. Their clarity is labeled aggression, not because they're unstable, but because their refusal to participate in the performance makes everyone else look down. And so the story gets rewritten. They're dramatic, they overreact, they always make things harder. The group begins to orbit around this false narrative, relieved now of any need to self-reflect. The scapegoat holds the tension, and in doing so, proves the system's illusion that the rest of us are fine, that the problem is you. This is not an accident, it's an unconscious agreement. Because if one person carries the chaos, no one else has to. And when that person starts to question it, when they try to set a boundary or step out of the role, they don't get thanked. They get erased, not just ignored, but rewritten. Any move towards self-clarity becomes ammunition. Any attempt to exit becomes proof. That's how the system protects itself. It doesn't punish behavior, it punishes disruption. And if you've ever walked away and still felt the ache of being blamed, misunderstood, or cast out without explanation, it wasn't your failure. It was your refusal to collapse in the way they needed you to. And the reason you were picked in the first place, that's what we expose next. Scapegoats aren't chosen at random. They're chosen because something about them makes denial harder to maintain. It can start with a tone shift, a moment of emotional clarity, a question asked too directly, and the room goes quiet, not because you said something wrong, but because you said something real. Scapegoats are selected because they violate the unspoken contract. Don't notice, don't name it, don't make anyone uncomfortable. They fail, not morally but structurally, to participate in the performance. That failure looks different depending on the system. Sometimes it's emotional intuition. Sometimes it's moral rigidity. Sometimes it's just the inability to lie convincingly. But the common thread is this. The scapegoat threatens narrative control. They name tension others are invested in avoiding. They ask, why does no one talk about this? They react to contradictions instead of swallowing them. And in families that survive by suppressing their own fragmentation, that reaction is a liability. From that point forward, they're watched. Their anger is no longer frustration, it's danger. Their pain is no longer valid, it's disruptive. Their sensitivity becomes a weapon others claim to be wounded by. It's a silent reassignment of blame. Not because you said too much, but because you refuse to keep pretending. And once you're marked, everything confirms it. You get cut out of conversations, treated as the one who always takes things the wrong way, framed as unstable when you cry and ungrateful when you don't. This is how the selection solidifies, not through declaration, but through pattern. Each reaction you have becomes the next justification for the role. They provoke the very traits they claim to be protecting themselves from. It's a trap, and it works because the scapegoat, more often than not, tries to fix it. They try to behave better, speak softer, be easier to love. But the role was never built on what you did. It was built on what the family couldn't face. And if you're still wondering how it happened, why it was you, what you did to deserve it, that question only works if the system is fair. It isn't. And what you internalized as guilt was never about harm. It was about usefulness, which is why the next layer isn't about morality. It's about programming. Most scapegoats don't feel guilty because they did something wrong. They feel guilty because the system taught them that clarity is cruelty and boundaries are betrayal. This is where the confusion sets in, because on the surface, guilt looks like conscience. It feels like moral failure, like maybe you really did overreact. Maybe you really were too sensitive. Maybe you could have just kept the peace a little longer. But what you're feeling isn't guilt. It's training. In high-control family systems, punishment doesn't always come through rage. It comes through withdrawal. Eye contact disappears. Tone shifts. Love becomes conditional, quietly, efficiently, without ever being named. And the message lands: when you're agreeable, you're safe. When you're silent, you're included. When you ask for too much, you lose everything. This kind of guilt isn't an emotion. It's a nervous system imprint. You speak up and your stomach tightens. You set a boundary and your body braces. You tell the truth and a voice inside whispers, "You've gone too far." This isn't intuition, it's survival memory. You were trained to interpret honesty as threat, and that training didn't stop when you walked away. It stayed in your posture, in your tone, in your instinct to soften yourself every time someone else becomes uncomfortable. Psychologist Alice Miller called this the trap of the good child, the one who learns early that safety comes not from being authentic, but from being manageable. You didn't need to be punished. You pre-punished yourself, hesitated before speaking, reworded the truth to make it easier to hear, apologized when no one asked. This is how systems sustain themselves without ever raising their voice. You carry the guilt for them. You internalize the tension so they can remain emotionally clean, and every time you doubt your experience, you reinforce their narrative. Not because you believe them, but because believing yourself still feels dangerous. This is what makes post-separation life so confusing. You know what happened. You know what you felt. But the guilt doesn't dissolve. It lingers. Because the punishment has ended, but the program hasn't. And that's exactly why you still feel like the bad one. Not because you were wrong, but because for years being wrong was the only way to stay connected. And if you finally disconnected, but the guilt is still echoing, that's not conscience, it's residue. And it's what makes you vulnerable to the next phase, not return. Relapse. The hardest part isn't walking away. It's letting go of the version of you who was still waiting to be chosen. Not consciously. You didn't sit by the phone hoping for an apology, but somewhere deeper, in the nervous system, in the internal storyline, you were still negotiating. If I'm good enough, they'll see me. If I'm calm enough, they'll trust me. If I'm patient enough, they'll come back with clarity. That's the real wound. Not the rejection, but the hope. the hope that if you played the role perfectly, the ending would change. This isn't delusion, it's survival logic. As children, we don't process betrayal. We create a fantasy that makes it tolerable. And if the family system ran on denial, you internalized it as a task. Be less, be easier, be useful enough to be included. This fantasy doesn't dissolve when you leave. It sharpens. Because now, without the noise and distraction of the system, you start to feel what the role was protecting you from. The grief. Not for who they were, but for who you thought they might become. For the version of them that would one day sit down and say, "We were wrong about you." That version isn't coming. Not because you didn't earn it, but because they were never trying to see you. They were trying to stay comfortable, and your clarity disrupted that. Your boundaries threatened it. Your presence made denial less convenient. So instead of choosing you, they chose the story. The one where you were difficult, unstable, too much. And even now, part of you still wants to rewrite it. To say one more thing, send one more message, show them how much work you've done. But you're not doing it for closure. You're doing it for the child in you who still thinks being chosen will make it stop hurting. It won't, because you weren't waiting for connection. You were waiting for permission, and now you don't need it. But letting go of that fantasy won't feel like power. It will feel like collapse. And that collapse, that emptiness that follows clarity, is not failure. It's withdrawal. And that's what we walk into next. No one talks about what happens after you walk away. You cut the cord. You name the truth. You do the thing they said you never would. Leave. And for a moment, it feels clean, sharp, certain. But then comes the silence. And in that silence, something breaks. Not in the system you left, but in you. Because for years, your identity was tied to containment. You were the one who absorbed tension, tracked mood shifts, translated dysfunction into understanding. You weren't just performing a role, you were surviving through it. And now that the performance is over, so is the structure that held you together. This is collapse, not depression, not regression. Collapse. A nervous system that's no longer operating in crisis, but hasn't learned how to be safe. You wake up numb. You reach for people you no longer trust. You replay moments you already understand, trying to feel something beyond dread. This isn't weakness, it's recalibration. When you spend years in high alert, survival becomes identity. And the moment danger is removed, your body doesn't relax. It loses direction. Because even if the system was cruel, it was familiar. And now, without it, your nervous system has no map. This is what therapists call the trauma vacuum. The grief that arrives when you're no longer busy defending yourself. You start to question the very choice that saved you. Was it really that bad? Maybe I exaggerated. Maybe if I'd said it differently. That's not logic. That's the body begging for what it used to call connection, even if that connection came at the cost of self-erasure. Because the fantasy doesn't die at the door. It dies in the silence that follows. And that silence doesn't feel like peace. It feels like death. The death of usefulness, the death of certainty, the death of the version of you who made pain functional. That version had purpose, held the family together, made everyone else okay. And now they're gone. And all you're left with is space, which doesn't feel healing. It feels hollow, but that hollow space is where identity gets rebuilt, and it has to stay hollow long enough for you to stop reaching backward, which becomes hardest when the system notices your absence, because it always does. And when it does, it comes back, not with apology, but with familiarity. That's what we name next. They don't return to reconnect. They return to regulate. Because your absence disrupts more than your presence ever did. You were the pressure valve, the distraction, the convenient proof that the problem was always someone else. And now that you're gone, the system has no scapegoat to orbit around. So they reach out, not with ownership, not with reflection, but with softness, politeness, familiarity. Just checking in. Hope you're doing okay. You've been on my mind. It sounds gentle, casual, even kind, but what it's really saying is, are you still in position? Are you still available to absorb what we won't? This is what the return test looks like. It's not a conversation. It's a probe, not to see how you are, but to see if the old contract can be reactivated. Because if you reply just once, just kindly, just to be civil, they don't take that as closure. They take it as access to your doubt, to your softness, to the part of you that still wants to be seen as good. But this test never comes with accountability. They don't say, we saw what we did. They say, we miss you. And for a moment you wonder, is that love? Is that progress? No, it's memory. Their memory of how useful your self-doubt used to be. The scapegoat doesn't just carry blame. They carry believability. They make the system's illusion feel real. And when you remove that, the others don't reorganize. They try to recover what you used to hold. So the moment you seem stable, healing, growing, unbothered, that's when the messages arrive. Because control is never about presence. It's about timing. They reach out during milestones, during silence, during moments of softness, not to reconnect, to reattach. And if you respond from guilt, from pity, from the urge to be polite, you're not re-entering a relationship. You're re-entering a role. That's why clarity isn't proven by silence. It's proven by the silence you choose to keep even when you're being invited back in. Because they're not asking for you. They're asking for the version of you that made everything easier. And once you recognize that, the next shift begins. The shift from reaction to authorship. That's what we close with next. You didn't walk away because you stopped caring. You walked away because you finally saw the cost of staying. Every conversation was a performance. Every truth had to be softened. Every boundary came with backlash. And somewhere along the way, you realized the only way to stay was to disappear. So you stopped disappearing, and they called it cruelty. But here's what they'll never admit, that your pain was never the problem. It was just the only part of the system that couldn't be controlled. You were labeled unstable because you wouldn't forget. You were blamed for the tension because you named it. And when that stopped working, they just stopped speaking. You were never too sensitive. You were too attuned. And that made you incompatible with a structure built on denial. Now in the silence that followed your exit, something else is forming. Not closure, not relief, just space. Space to hear your own thoughts without editing them. Space to feel your own pain without performing it. Space to stop translating yourself into something more acceptable. That space may feel empty right now, but it's not. It's yours. And it's the first thing you've had that wasn't handed to you with conditions. So no, you're not the villain. You're just the one who stopped playing a role that made everyone else comfortable. And if you're still wondering whether you did the right thing, ask yourself this: who benefits when you doubt your own clarity? Because that doubt isn't instinct, it's inheritance. And today, you don't have to carry it.